What is up, everyone? Welcome back to GrayDaystv, and today I'm going to be talking about the disappearance of Karen Schepers. Karen Scheppers was 23 years old at the time of her disappearance and was last seen in Carpentersville, Illinois on April 16th of 1983. She graduated from Sycamore High School and worked as a computer programmer at First Chicago Bank Card. By all accounts, she loved her job and she enjoyed a couple hobbies including sewing, knitting, and playing the piano. And she was also not known to owe any significant debts to anyone. So on the night of her disappearance, Karen went to PM Bentley's, which was a bar in Carpentersville, Illinois, and she went there with about 20 to 30 of her coworkers to celebrate her recent promotion, which is pretty crazy on its own because I have never worked anywhere where I had 20 to 30 coworkers that I would be willing to hang out with. So while she was there, she called her boyfriend, Terry Schultz, and asked him if he wanted to come join her. But he declined because he said he had to wake up early the next day to go to work. Now, while on the phone, they apparently got into a fight, but friends of Karen said that she seemed to be in relatively high spirits even after the phone call. So the last time anyone in her friend group saw Karen that night was when she was on stage participating in a hula hoop contest. But by 1 a.m., everyone who had went there with her was gone and she was left there by herself. Now, I've done a couple of stories about women and men in bars, and this is usually when things take a turn, when their friends leave them alone. Never, ever, ever leave your friend alone at a bar. I don't care what time it is, what's going on. You never leave your friend who's probably been drinking alone at a bar. That's like rule number one. So it is assumed that Karen left the bar in her yellow Toyota Celica around 1 a.m. after everyone else had left. But there's no proof that this happened because no one actually saw her leave. It's also unclear if Karen had even made it back home that night because no one knew she went missing until 2 days later. And when they did go to her home and investigate, everything seemed in the place it should have been. Her apartment was found in perfect order with no signs of a struggle and no signs that she had packed up and left for an extended amount of time. And $8,000 were also left in her bank account and have not been touched to this day. Now, because the only event that stuck out in people's minds that night was the fact that she got in an argument with her boyfriend over the phone, he of course became the main suspect in this case. And he became even more of a person of interest after police got a phone call that said, "Karen and I planned this." That was all the phone call said, and it was an anonymous phone call. So according to one account, Karen's boyfriend actually stated that him and Karen had broken up prior to her disappearance, something that her family had not known about. But according to another source, they had not broken up and only called off their engagement that they had because neither of them felt like they were ready for marriage. And it had been reported that the two still had a really good relationship with each other even after they called off the engagement, which is probably why she called and asked him to come out and hang out with her that night. And to me, it seems as though they were in a situation where they didn't know that they were broken up yet. Like maybe he felt as though he made it clear that they were broken up, but she didn't get the message, or he probably wasn't even that clear with what he was saying to her, and she felt that they were still in a relationship, close friends. Or maybe it was just they were just in that in-between area where you're not broken up yet, but you know that it's the writing's on the wall and you know that that's coming. But I thought it was really interesting that he stated that they were broken up, and then someone else had said no, they weren't. They were just taking a couple steps back. So that's very interesting. But Karen's boyfriend was eventually asked to take a polygraph test, and he did pass that polygraph test. And after passing that polygraph test, he continued to be as helpful as he could with the investigation and with law enforcement. And he even assisted in searches with law enforcement until he became ill and was confined to a wheelchair. He also went on to speak with media and express his guilt about not coming out that night and being with Karen, which I'm sure anyone in that situation would do the same thing, because you're going to blame yourself a little bit because you feel as though if I was there, I would have been with her, she wouldn't have been alone, and she wouldn't have went missing. And for me, I think that's what makes life so interesting to begin with. It's choices like that, those that seem simple, that seem like they won't matter that much, but then they change the entire course of your life. Because he decided, I'm just going to sleep in tonight because I have to work early in the morning. He didn't go out. Because he didn't go out, Karen disappeared, and his life went into a completely different pattern than it would have, and hers went into a completely different pattern as well. So I just find stuff like that really interesting, that those tiny little choices you make change things completely. And later in life, he did eventually go on to marry someone else. which I don't see that as a red flag or anything like that. You gotta move on eventually. Karen was legally declared dead in 1993. So after that point, you're gonna kind of keep hopes up, but you eventually have to move on with your life. But Karen's family had been critical of police, stating that Terry, along with Karen's stepmother, with a history of physical abuse towards her, were the sources of information that police relied on the most. So police didn't really listen to the other side, the other people in her family. They only listened to the stepmother and the boyfriend, or they used their information the most out of everyone else. And of course, you're going to feel a certain type of way if it seems as though the police are ignoring you when you're trying to help them find someone, a family member of yours, someone that you love, someone that you miss. So I'll understand that. But like I mentioned earlier, 10 years later, Karen was declared legally dead in 1993. And there has still been no activity on her bank accounts or her social security number or anything like that. And she has not been seen since that day on April 16th of 1983. So let's get into some theories. So the first and most popular theory is that on the way home, Karen crashed her car into a heavily wooded area or a somewhat large body of water, and that is why she hasn't been seen since. Now, this is the most popular theory because this is something that happens a lot more often than you would actually think. Most of the time when someone goes missing along with their car, the outcome is usually this. They got into an accident and their car went off the road into a body of water and just sort of got swept away up the river, or covered with silt or sand, or maybe just even landed in a very heavily wooded area and just no one's been able to pinpoint where they went missing and look in that area. A lot of the time it takes 10 plus years and then their car's found in a lake, in a river, or something along those lines. So this is a very reasonable theory on what happened to her. I can't find any source of information that explicitly states that she was drinking that night, but it's safe to assume that if she went out with that many friends to a bar, she probably had at least one or two drinks. You couple that with the fact that the weather was extremely bad that night. The weather conditions that night were described as foggy with rain/drizzle and snow/ice pellets. With that, it's not hard to believe that she just got into a situation where she wasn't at the best state to drive in, and she got into an accident and fell into the river. And this is the theory that I believe in the most. I think it's the most possible and the most probable. And I think eventually her body and her car will be found in a large body of water, or maybe even in a dense forest area. Another theory is that Karen was kidnapped that night. Maybe someone saw Karen, a woman all alone who had been drinking that night, walking to her car alone, and they said, hey, this is a perfect situation to kidnap someone. So they ran up to her, they forced her inside of her car, and they drove her into the night somewhere. That is a perfectly reasonable theory on what happened to her. And it could very well have happened to her. And maybe that person was random. Maybe it was a co-worker jealous of her promotion. Or maybe it was her boyfriend. Just because he passed a lie detector test doesn't mean that he had nothing to do with what happened to her. There are so many cases where someone passes a lie detector test and then later on it seems as though that was probably the person. Just because they passed a lie detector test doesn't mean anything. So I don't really use, I don't care if they pass a lie detector test. That doesn't change my mind on whether they're a suspect or not. But if I'm being honest, I don't believe that her boyfriend had anything to do with this. I'm just throwing out theories at this point. And it's perfectly reasonable to think that him or a coworker, or maybe even just a random person that saw her all alone, kidnapped her that night and murdered her or did whatever they did to her, because that's always an option. I believe that 9 times out of 10 it's usually the first theory, in where they just got into an accident and no one's been able to find the car. But there's always that 1 out of 10 chance that something like this did happen and that she was kidnapped and taken somewhere. So you can never rule out anything, especially in cases like this where it's not solved. So although it's been 36 years since Karen went missing and 26 years since she was legally declared dead, hopefully sometime soon we are able to close this case, because you have to remember there's a family out there who have no idea what happened to their daughter, their sister, their cousin, their friend. And I personally believe that is probably the most horrible thing that can happen to a family. Knowing that you'll never see this person that you love so much ever again, but not knowing why you'll never see them. not knowing what happened to them, where their body is, not being able to bury their body in a cemetery and being able to visit them. That's something that's closure that a lot of families need, but unfortunately, more than you think, a lot of families don't get. So hopefully this case is closed sometime soon and that family gets closure. But that is the end of this video. Make sure to let me know what you guys think about this case. Tell me which theory you believe in, or if you have a theory on your own. What is it? I'd love to hear it. Also, make sure to like, comment, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. There are new videos every week, and I would love for you to join the GrayDays TV family. But that's all I have to say. Make sure you guys have a great day, great week, great month, great year. And I will catch you next video.